Welcome, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today at the MarkeTech Group webinar, Pricing 301. This is the last primer of a three-part series we had 101 and 201 a few months ago. I am Christian Renaudin. I'm the founder and CEO of the MarkeTech Group. We are a leading voice of customer marketing consultancy for medical technology companies, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Davis for this very special webinar session. Scott, you're the principal and founder of Strategic Marketing Decision. It's a consultancy that specializes in product design and strategic pricing. You've been in practice about 20 years or more. We've worked together, I know, for over 15 years on dozens of projects that involve your skills and talent in modeling, which you will share today.
Thousands may be a bit of an overstatement.
And so you have a PhD in economics with a minor in business from Stanford University. You currently serve as an adjunct professor at the Sallence School of Business at the University of Rochester in conjunction with their Center for Pricing. But you also taught at Washington University in St. Louis, Olin School of Business, UC Davis here at Graduate School of Management. You were also teaching at Haas School of Management, Berkeley. Graduate School of Business from Stanford University, the Carlson School of Management, University of Minnesota, and last but not least, Anderson School of Management at UCLA. Very impressive resume, Scott, and what a great experience. So we're very happy to have you today.
That's nice to be with you.
Thank you. So today, of course, we want to talk about pricing decision and get the price right. So let's start right away with an example. A standard analysis from McKinsey that shows for a firm the impact of just leaving 1% on the table in terms of price. And what the impact is actually, if you look, this 1% price difference could have an impact of 8% profit increase. Amazing. Scott, is this typical of this type of company?
It's not unusual at all. If you can assume that you aren't going to be losing any business, if you can get a 1% improvement in revenue, oftentimes it will generate a substantial increase in profit. It depends on your margins. This is an example for a typical Fortune 1500 company. Your results may vary. But the bottom line is if you can improve price just by a little bit, it can have a very big impact on the bottom line.
And that's the point of the webinar today, Scott. Do what you can to best predict how sales will respond to price change, even that a small change. And if you can improve your pricing decisions by just a little bit, again, which you see it's probably worth the investment to go for the higher precision. We're going to show today how these models can greatly be improved if we take into account other factors that are not taken into account in classic modeling, and that influence purchase, of course. Doing so would allow us to build what we call a market model. The market model can be used to further improve pricing decision. So again, the goal for today is to really improve precision and closely predict real market behavior as opposed to just a choice exercise in a preference model. But I think it's probably important that we first speak about the pyramid of modeling. So this concept, of course, is we start with a preference model. Nothing wrong with that, but again, as we will see, it has some shortcomings to really predict customer choice.
It provides a real solid basis for understanding what drives customer decisions.
Exactly. And then obviously going to the market model to improve the price decision and hopefully optimize price. And again, the goal is to really improve and help our customers who are supposed to launch those products with better estimates to forecast the change as a function of price in a much more accurate way. But I think first you wanted to remind the audience of the different ways you can actually measure the value and price sensitivity. Some of it that we have addressed before in the prior webinar, but I think it's important to do a really quick recap on that.
Yeah, since we're looking at moving beyond preference models, I think it's useful to get a little bit of an idea of where the preferences come from. There are broadly three approaches to obtaining preferences. One is through direct questioning. A simple direct question would be, how much would you be willing to pay for this product, or how much would you be willing to pay for this feature? And as you can imagine, that's probably not going to be very reliable. Oftentimes, people will understate what they would be willing to pay for a particular product or feature. There are other better approaches that would say, okay, consider product A at a price of 100 and product B with all of these other features. At what price would you be indifferent between product A and product B? That's what is known as a dollar metric. You can also get measures of price acceptability using a von Westendorp type method, which is discussed in Pricing 101.
Correct. Yes, 101, we did discuss that.
And so, there are a number of different approaches that are kind of quick and dirty, but better than flying blind and purely using the Force unless you were a Jedi Master. So the next set of approaches that are commonly applied are what are known as monetary or economic value approaches. In these approaches, what you want to try to do is understand the impact of a product alternative on the client's or customer's bottom line. So the first part of this is to understand what alternative they are currently purchasing. And that gives you a purchase price and a reference value. And then you want to take a look at the difference in the cost of using that alternative, which may relate to things like maintenance. It may deal with the amount of input that's required to produce an output. Can you produce something faster, which would save on labor time? What is expected downtime? Things along those lines. So that provides what is known as a differentiation value. And by examining the reference value or replacement value and the differentiation value, you can get an idea of how much financial benefit a customer will receive by a product at a given price. So that would be another measure of preference.
Yep.
Okay, the third approach, I believe, was covered in your webinar 201. It's conjoint and trade-off, which is a survey-based approach where essentially you try to identify what the decision drivers are. You identify the key set of attributes that influence purchases. And then for each attribute, you want to identify different levels that could possibly exist in the market. And you use that information to create a set of hypothetical profiles. And then you ask people to evaluate those different profiles. There are two basic approaches. One is what is known as a paired comparison task, which is sort of the traditional way of doing conjoint studies. And in these studies, you take two profiles. Here we have brand, field of view, gradients, and price, and two different possible options. And then we ask them, well, which of these two do you prefer? And on top of that, typically we ask for a strength of preference, which adds additional information. So not only do you know if option one was preferred to option two, you know if it was by a lot or just a little, or if they're indifferent. And that is handy information that allows you to have smaller sample sizes, and it still is helpful in some ways. The problem is that's not the way people actually evaluate products when making purchase decisions. When making purchase decisions, they look at a set of options and they choose one. So there's been a migration into an approach called the choice-based model, where people are confronted with a set of options. Here we see three different options that have different characteristics: brand, field of view, etc. And then we say, okay, if these were the only options, which would you choose? They could choose option one, option two, option three. And another advantage of a choice-based model is it also allows people to choose none of the above, if that's a viable option, where they will stick with what they have or do without. So the advantage of this is it mimics how people actually make purchase decisions. The downside from a statistical point of view is you don't get as much information. You only find out which option is preferred. You don't have any measure of how much it was preferred by. Was it a close call or a runaway? That means that you have to have larger sample sizes, and you end up having to pool information across respondents. The output of conjoint analysis is a measure of the value of each different attribute level based on the preferences or evaluations that were made. So these are what are known as part worth utilities. So here we see different part worth utilities for different manufacturers. This is part worth for a particular respondent, and GE shouldn't take anything away from this particular example. We have a response to field of view. We have different values for the for the resolution and different responses for price. And we actually see in this case that prices above $1 million start causing the customer to flinch.
Typical curve, yes.
So what you end up doing is you take the values associated, the part worth utilities associated with the values of each of the different alternatives, and you can calculate the utility of each alternative. Now, in a simple model, you would say, okay, the alternative that has the highest utility would be the one that is chosen. But in reality, we typically assume that there is some error either on our measurement or there may be some random factors that we didn't measure and so on. So usually these preference measures and utility estimates are put into a preference model where you try to predict the probability of choosing the product, and the probability of choosing a product is proportional to how attractive it is relative to the alternatives. So by taking E to an estimated parameter beta to the utility of product 1, dividing by the sum of E to the beta utilities of all the different options, you get the probability of choosing product 1, and you get the probabilities of choosing all the different alternatives in the same way.
So that's an impressive formula, Scott. Here.
Yes, it's kind of nasty looking, but if you think of it as kind of an us over us plus them, it's relatively intuitive. But it's a way of capturing the error and making it so that if you make a little tiny pricing mistake, it's not like you lose the entire business with a probability of 1.
Okay.
So what ends up coming out of this analysis is a probability of choosing each alternative, which translates into market share.
Mm-hmm.
Oops.
Forward. Yep.
And this is an example of a pie chart that would reflect the predicted market shares based on a preference model.
Right.
So we have, in this case, 5 different options, and we see the brand C is most preferred. Now, if you lower the price of one of the options, that will raise the utility of that option, and as a result, you'll increase the market share. So
right.
This looks nice.
Correct.
But what you want to do is you want to see if this actually corresponds to what you actually observe in the real world. Now, if we take a look at it, and this is based on an actual study, we observe, well, gee, we predicted brand C would be really dominant, and they aren't nearly as dominant as we would have expected. And brand B is much stronger than we predicted, and so is brand A. So
how could we explain the difference?
Well, there are a couple of different possibilities. We put on our detective's hat and we start trying to figure out what is causing the difference.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one set of things. It could just be that you didn't design the right study. You made some mistakes up front. You may have omitted a key decision variable, or you may have misspecified the range of attributes or levels. So if you make a mistake up front, then the preference model isn't going to be very predictive. So you want to be careful about that. And although constructing a conjoint may look easy, it's very easy to make mistakes, which can make the model non-functional.
And that's why we have a process here at MarkeTech Group to really make sure we have the right attribute selection, the right levels. But even that is not enough because there are other effects that you want to talk about.
Right. So another thing in the study design that you want to consider is, are you framing the attributes properly? And in particular, you want to make sure the price is framed properly. Now, one thing to consider are what are known as reference price effects. So if people are used to purchasing a product over time and they expect to pay a price for a product and all of a sudden you're planning on changing it, they will respond differently to that changed price than they would in a conjoint type of task that doesn't establish that reference point. So in a conjoint study, you want to make sure that the reference price is, well established, that the number of units are, adequately reflected. So you want to frame the price in terms of the context in which they'll buy. So if you've got a consumable product that, say, is proportional to the number of hospital beds, maybe you want to include what the expected cost will be based on your number of beds the customer has, and present that value, because that will be the one that will trigger the actual purchase decision. So a lot of this comes from properly understanding the decision process. Okay? So preference models represent a great improvement over using the force, using intuition. But the problem is oftentimes preference models will miss some things that are relevant in terms of making actual purchase decisions. So I argue that there are higher mountains that you can climb. And those higher mountains fall into the category of what we would call market models, and they account for different things.
Okay. So that's exactly what we're going to need to do, is basically how do we cross the chasm. This is really what the webinar is about today. And I think it's about building better models, as you just said, and there are a number of things that we need to watch for.
So we're going to introduce some things that can be used to improve preference models that can be built in as part of a well-designed preference study that can be used to go to the next level and create a market model that more accurately reflects choice. So one would be to keep in mind that preference is only one of multiple factors influencing choice. So other relevant factors might include marketing activities. They might include purchase decision processes that don't account for all the available alternatives or all of the available information. And we also will want to take advantage of actual observed purchase history to calibrate our models to make sure that we get the best possible fit between what we predict and, as a result, our estimated price response and the actual purchase data.
So I think at this point it's good to see potentially a model, an end product, so people can really appreciate and understand the difference between a preference model and a market model. So this is a company X, Innovatrix, we call it. So could you please explain the setup of this output?
Yes, this is based on a client. It's essentially capital equipment with purchase. We have our client, Innovatrix, and then we have two competitors. And one thing to note is that Innovatrix has 8 variants, or will after they introduce this new product. And we're looking at the impact of introducing a new version of the product along with the legacy. And you'll see that there are 8 options here as opposed to 4 of the different competitors. They also have lease options versus purchase options, so that's where you need to be careful about framing. I don't know if their screens are flashing like ours are, but that's not a special effect that normally goes into the simulators.
Right.
Another thing that we're interested in is what happens to adoption over time. So we see that in year 1, only certain segments will be relatively aware of the product, and then the market becomes more and more aware over time. So you want to be able to model that effect, which reflects awareness of the different products. And another thing that was important here is we did survey people with different roles in the company, and we found that some roles had a greater reliability in terms of prediction. And we can talk a little bit later about how we can integrate roles of multiple decision makers.
So this model is really a dynamic model, so we can change price.
Yes, so if you wanted to change the price, let's say you wanted to encourage the silver lease, I guess, let's say we wanted to discourage the silver purchase.
Yes.
you can adjust the price.
And then obviously you are able with the market model to calculate not just the units, the revenue, but also the profit. And we can see in this pie chart how this is impacting the market share as well.
Right. So it allows you to predict what will happen to your profits and overall market share and performance when you change prices of your options.
Yeah, so if I change that 2, for example, at 30,000, we'll see a great impact as well. Okay, and so the question that people may ask before we go back to the presentation: have you ever verified that actually it predicted correctly? Is this really checked over time? Did it go through the test of the actual truth, like we did earlier on the preference model?
We have on several occasions. When we have followed up, we have found very reliable results. I think there was one client who said that this was within 1 or 2% of what they actually observed, based on the prices that we recommended that they charge.
Right.
And oftentimes, clients are happy enough that they'll want to get another one done.
Okay, and so the point again is a greater precision in market share prediction, and we saw earlier that one little price change that changed the revenue 1% had big impact on profit. So again, this is probably worth the extra precision. Now let's talk about the different things we need to do, to really create a market model, to go again crossing the chasm from the preference model to the market model. And I think you start with the marketing variables or marketing elements that need to be looked into to account for it. So the number one issue, Scott, is the purchase likelihood. Customer purchase likelihood is likely to be influenced by marketing and sales activities. Of course, that should be taken into account.
So, yeah, this stands to reason, but it's not something you can include in a conjoint analysis. So an attribute value of is advertised a lot is probably not going to get a lot of preference reflected in a conjoint analysis. So you need to try to measure this outside of a conjoint analysis. You can see that the relationship with a sales force or advertising effort would have an impact on sales, but it would be apart from the conjoint. So the goal here is to try to understand how advertising and sales force work. So this can be a problem if there are distinct differences in how products receive support by their companies. Does one sales force have a better relationship with the client? And you want to try to measure that as much as possible. Also, resellers can influence sales and choice. So if a customer uses a particular reseller and that reseller promotes the product, we want to try to capture that. So those products that are more heavily promoted and have greater sales support will have higher shares and will be predicted by preference models. So preference models will systematically underestimate the sales of products that are heavily advertised or receive effective sales support. Also, the sales of alternatives that are effectively bundled or promoted will also tend to be underestimated.
So how do we address that in the model?
Well, there are a couple of ways that we want to try to do this and that have worked for us in the past. One is to measure the familiarity with different marketing alternatives or marketing activities. So we will ask survey respondents how familiar they are with a particular marketing activity to get a measure of awareness of it. We try to measure the quality of the relationship between different manufacturers, sales forces, and the customers, or what the customer service is like. So we can get a feeling for their perceptions of the relationship with the client or with the company that is different from what you could obtain through a conjoint analysis. And if possible, we can also get measures of advertising and marketing expenditures and use those to use as kind of like a surrogate to utility in that logit model.
Right.
So we use these models or use this information, and we construct statistical models to help us predict what the relationship is between these activities and sales, and that helps us improve predictive accuracy. So we'll choose a model that best fits the data. So we want to look at measurements that will improve the fit.
Great. Now we have to look into also the decision process. It's a very important element, especially in healthcare where you've got multiple stakeholders, value committee, and so forth. So there's a second issue is that some brand may not be in a choice set. For example, a GPO, there's a restriction. You can't play with all brands. It's restricted choice. So how do we describe that issue for us?
Well, one thing that happens in preference models is you implicitly assume that customers are paying attention to all of the available information and they are considering all of the available alternatives. So there are many situations where some alternatives may not be available or may not be considered.
Right.
So one reason may be that they're just not aware of the product, and this is particularly important for new products. So if you think back to the example in the simulator, the market model, we were looking at the rollout over time, and one of the assumptions that we were dealing with over time is the increasing awareness of the product as it got rolled out. You may end up having a product that's not in the choice set because their chosen vendor may not carry the product or may not display it.
Right.
Or there may be a deal breaker that isn't adequately identified in the conjoint analysis. Now, what are the implications for pricing? Well, price changes won't influence sales if the product is not considered. So you may try to increase sales by lowering price, but if the reason you're not getting sales is because it's not in the choice set, then you're going to overestimate the response to price using a traditional preference models. And also, non-price marketing efforts may need to be required to get the product considered. So in identifying these sorts of things, you can actually measure how well your sales force measures up compared to others, and it can identify how critical marketing efforts are in actually getting the product sold. So this can be a problem, in particular when purchases are routinized, where they automatically rebuy a product,
right,
without really going and looking at the set of alternatives, in which case cutting price probably isn't going to get their attention unless you have a sales rep going in and communicating that information. So if you are trying to predict market response without marketing activities, you are going to be over-predicting the impact of, say, a price decrease. Again, if different resellers like GPOs offer different product selections, you may cut price. You may have good market penetration. We actually found this with a client. They had good market penetration in the GPOs where their product was distributed, poor sales, as in no sales, in the GPOs where their product wasn't distributed, and they wanted to try to increase sales by lowering price, but that would have no impact because the product just wasn't in the choice set of many of those customers. So preference models fall short by overestimating the attractiveness of unfamiliar or new alternatives. This is very important when you are launching a new product, that you want to try to build in awareness and familiarity when building models of adoption. And also if you're trying to predict the sales of products that have limited or selected distribution.
So how do we address that in the model?
We address it by, first of all, measuring the familiarity with different alternatives, to see if there are problems with some alternatives not being familiar to people. If offerings vary across vendors, we try to identify which vendors are used, and then we want to try to identify which products those vendors carry and support. And then we ask customers to describe how they determine what their choice set is. So what we'll end up doing is we will modify that logit model by excluding options that aren't considered, or weighting options based on reduced awareness. And that gives more reliable predictions of sales.
Okay. Very good. So there's another issue now. Decision makers will often take steps to reduce their decision-making effort. So we have now the opposite problem, where in some conjoint tasks that we show, because again, we're still doing a conjoint for market model, we may force people to consider factors that in reality they may not pay much attention to, just by the effect of showing the task. And so that's the opposite problem. So please explain this particular situation.
Well, in a conjoint task, you have a set of attribute levels, and sometimes that list of attribute levels can get rather large.
Right.
And if you're sticking a lot of attribute levels in front of people and asking them to process that information, they won't want to exert the mental effort, especially in a survey task. So
right.
They will tend to take shortcuts.
Right.
And if price is one of 8 attributes as opposed to 1 out of 4, they're going to pay less attention to price. So what ends up happening is when you have a lot of attributes, people will spread their attention out among the attributes that you show them, even though those attributes probably won't be very carefully considered when making their purchase decisions.
Right.
So, this can be a pretty big problem if the product is complex. If you have lots of different attributes, if you have 10, and I've done conjoints where we've had over 20 attributes, and, you can imagine that can get to be sort of overwhelming. We have ways of dealing with it, and I'll share some of those with you. But this is a problem with complex products in particular. Also, if the decision makers are not the primary users, you're going to be sticking a lot of benefits in front of the survey respondent that they're not going to pay a lot of attention to, at least until persuaded by people who are users. If the alternatives are categorized and categories are screened based on one or more attributes, then you might get some narrowing based on category, and you will have simplification of decisions that way. And we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Correct. Yes.
So preference models will fall short by overestimating the value of non-critical features and of new features. So if new features are not familiar to customers, or the benefits of those new features are not obvious without sales support, you're going to overestimate what the market response will be. The other thing is that you underestimate the sensitivity to price, because if price becomes one of many attributes that respondent is forced to consider in a preference study, they won't pay as much attention to it as they probably
really
would.
A delicate balance about the design again, but also what can we do in the model?
Yes, we want to try to address that in the model. And one of the key things is that you want to begin preference measurement when there are a lot of attributes with self-stated attribute importance. So one approach that we've taken is we've asked people to, for example, in the study where we had 20 attributes, we said choose the 5 that are most important to you. Now, we may not want to cut the number of attributes down to 5 because it may be a different 5 for different respondents, but what we will end up doing is we will do a conjoint study based on the 5 or 6 attributes that the customer says are the most important. And the other thing that we can do is we can assume that utility weights estimated for some of these other attributes are pretty close to 0. So we will tend to zero out values of attributes that the respondent says is less important. Again, that doesn't mean that you will have 0 value in the market, but it may have 0 value for a particular respondent.
So again, I just want to point out that a lot of our clients, they really want to have a lot of attributes sometimes because there is this anxiety that we're missing out something important. But I think we have a rational way to decrease the number of attributes, either by testing with customers or the customer internal knowledge with a team who could say, well, it's not really important and we can cut that one out.
And also it is possible to provide a customized set of attributes for different respondents.
And that's the adaptive conjoint, for example.
Yeah, an adaptive conjoint is one approach to do that.
Correct. Now, there is an area that really I know is important to you, Scott, and makes us quite unique, because I know some pricing firms don't really address that. And it's the concept of nested decision making, nested choice. Could you please explain that concept and why it is important in modeling?
Yeah, well, nested decision making goes back to the idea that when people make purchase decisions, they simplify the choice process. And essentially what they will tend to do is they will tend to break product alternatives down into categories. So an obvious category would be manufacturer. So going back to the example that we discussed with the Conjoint study, you might have GE and Siemens and Philips, and people will have different attitudes toward those different brands, and then choose a manufacturer, and then choose among the different brands.
Right.
Or
and we've seen and in healthcare, there are numerous examples like this. For example, in CT, people may decide, I'm focusing on a 64 slicer as opposed to 16 slice or 128 slice, so they make a category decision. We have other example with X-ray room where people would like to consider a ceiling mount versus a floor mount versus a U-arm. But sometimes they do consider all of them across the board. Or a laryngoscope, for example, on card versus portable. It's always a lot of categories in healthcare medical device products. So I think it's very relevant to study that.
And the problem is, if you don't capture that effect, you are subjecting yourself to big errors in estimation. And this is a real big problem for companies that are going to be expanding their product line.
So I think you want to use a consumer fast food example to re-illustrate the point, Scott.
Right. So I think that it's easier, although this is a healthcare discussion, and we're going to be talking about foods that probably aren't the best for your health. But let's consider the example of a restaurant that serves hamburgers and hot dogs, and they have servers that serve them. You have a typo. And assume that the price is set such that the customer is indifferent between hamburgers and hot dogs. Christian, if you were to do a preference model, what would you expect the preference shares to be?
Well, I'd say if we're looking at category here, I would say 50-50.
Yeah. If you're indifferent between two alternatives and they're equally aware of the two alternatives, you would expect market shares to be 50-50.
Right.
Now, let's suppose that we go one step further and add a cheeseburger to the menu.
Right.
We have a price premium charged to it, so that the price, with the price premium, the cheeseburger is indifferent to the hamburger.
Okay.
And the hamburgers are both burger types, therefore are indifferent to the hot dog.
Right.
The traditional preference model would predict market shares of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3.
Logically, yes.
So, Christian, is this what you would expect to happen?
Well, I think in reality, if you're making the point of category decision, I think that might not be the case.
Yeah, what would happen, or what could happen in this case,
right,
is you might say, well, am I in the mood for a burger or a hot dog?
Right.
And that's the first decision that's made. And then once you've decided, I want a burger, then you decide between hamburgers and cheeseburgers. So if you're making the choice between hot dogs and burgers, then that choice is 50-50. And then within the burger category, it's 50-50 between those two category, or those two options, given that you're in the burger category. So in actuality, what you may see is, market share for hot dogs being 50% and cheeseburgers and hamburgers at 25% each. So essentially, by adding another option, you're probably doing more to cannibalize your own sales than you are to expand the market. Now, if cheeseburgers were noticeably attractive relative to the other two, then it would increase the share of burgers, relative to hot dogs as well. But not accounting for this nested decision would probably overpredict the sales of this new option.
So just to summarize, coming back to healthcare, so if it's a X-ray room and I have ceiling mount, floor mounted, or U-arm as three categories, the classic approach that most people do will equally assess all those different product alternatives, and then we get into the third problem here. And what you're saying, if we take into account a nested choice model decision where people think about, am I a ceiling floor mount or versus a floor mount, then you end up having different different shares of different products.
Yeah, preference models have this characteristic known as independence of irrelevant alternatives,
right,
which essentially says that if you add a new alternative, it will draw equally in proportion from all of the existing alternatives.
Correct.
But in reality, a new product may draw more from some products than others. And in particular, if you're a manufacturer introducing a new variant, that new variant was probably going to draw more from your existing variants than it will from competitors. It may still expand market share, but using a traditional preference model, you would greatly overestimate what the sales would be.
So I know you're going to tell us, and I know this is your claim to fame, nested choice, and you're one of the few, you're one of the few pricing experts who can model that. So let's talk about how you do it.
Well, what we end up doing is, first of all, we will try to get a feeling for what kinds of decision processes the customer has, and we will often provide them with a set of statements that best, which of these best describes how you make your decision. Do you choose manufacturer first? Do you choose vendor first? Is there a product form that you choose? So we can get that information from the customer and build a nested choice model that way. Another would be to try different nested choice models and see which ones fit the actual purchase data the best.
Okay.
But, if you're looking at introducing a new product and adding to a current product line, I really encourage you to consider this issue, because I do think that you could overestimate the impact and market share of a new alternative.
Very good. There's one last issue we wanted to discuss, is of course very key to healthcare, the multiple party involved in decision making, and so this is really different from the consumer world. So you want to explain to us how we identify and address that issue?
Yeah, one of the big problems is that different parties that influence decisions have different agendas. Okay, and you want to try to sort through all of those different agendas and measure value to those different constituents, or see how those people will influence the purchase decision. So if you were only measuring the value of one party, it better be the one that essentially drives the decision. But if you do that, your choice estimates are probably going to be biased. So this could be a problem when the final decision maker is heavily influenced by the requests or recommendations of primary users. We did one study where we surveyed the attitudes of C-suite people with regard to a capital purchase.
Right.
And that actually was the case in this example. And we got a set of preferences, and we did a preference model, and we saw that it had no correspondence to actual purchases. And then what we did a similar study with user managers, nurse managers and that sort of thing, who actually oversee the use of the system. And we found that those people predicted choice much better, or the model based on their preferences.
So typically a visit, what we call a service line manager, a head of a department or administrative person, in imaging, because with a lot of studies we do in imaging, that would be a director of imaging.
Right.
Or a director of OR, or a director of pharmacy, that layer of the management in a hospital. Is that what you mean, Scott?
Yeah, oftentimes they will know what features are most important, whereas the C-suite will tend to be focused more on the bottom line.
Right.
And, so you want to make sure that even though the C-suite is the final decision maker, their preferences, as you measure them in a survey, probably are not going to reflect choice very well.
Okay.
So you want to try to identify the roles of the different decision makers. So preference models fall short by providing biased sales estimates when you only address the preferences of a single party. And if you don't account for the interactions amongst the interested parties, you will have systematic errors. So ways that you can address the problem. First thing I think that is important when you have committee or group decisions, you really need to do some studies of the decision process. And I think qualitative studies up front are very important. Also within written surveys, if you can identify the key decision maker, they pretty much have a handle on what those processes and what kinds of things the C-suite is going to push back on, and you can elicit those likely responses from the key decision maker. So you want to identify the party with the greatest influence on the final decision, even if they're not the final purchasing decision maker. And then what you can do is, if you do a study of C-suite folks, find out the norms. Okay, where are budget thresholds where they're likely to kick in? Where are the deal breakers? And then you can build those into your models along with the preferences of the primary decision maker. So generic approaches would be to estimate a joint utility function. One would be to get the committee together and take the survey jointly. That's really hard to do, but it would be an ideal way of doing it. The other would be to have them take surveys independently and then use average values, across respondents for certain classes of decision makers, and then build a hybrid choice model that way. Another would be to treat the decision as a sequential process where one party determines a set of acceptable alternatives. For example, a C-suite might set a budget constraint, and then the other frontline managers, I'll describe them, will end up choosing the alternative that best satisfies their demands given the budget constraint.
Okay. Well, I think that's an excellent overview, and I know there are a few other things we can do to create an ideal market model, but I think if we summarize what you've talked about, going from preference model to market model, again, crossing the chasm, getting to the next peak, to have more real life purchase decision and more prediction, better, more accurate prediction. You talked about marketing and sales activities to take into account, sales force promotion, that sort of thing. We talked about the issue of reduced choice sets, whether it's artificially done by a GPU effect or by the effect of the design of the survey or the conjoint. The simplified decision issues that we talked about. And we talked about nested choice, which is a very important categorical-based decision making, and it's a typical modeling issue. And finally, the issue you just mentioned of multiple decision makers to take into account for an ideal modeling situation. So again, to improve accuracy of prediction. So again, we need to make sure we have an ideal market model. Shall we just go a few minutes to look at the simulator again?
Sure, I'll point out where some of these things entered in.
Absolutely. So let's go and come back.
Okay, so if you take a look at the underlying preferences, we did do a survey of C-suite and frontline manager. I want to disguise the product sufficiently. The frontline manager folks, and we found a much greater fit between the preferences of the frontline managers than the C-suite, even though the C-suite signed the check. And the other thing that we saw here is since Innovatrix had twice as many options, the preference model greatly overpredicted the sales of Innovatrix, and they already dominate the market, but we actually had predictions of like 90% market share, which was inaccurate. So, using the nested choice model, we were able to address that factor. Now, we had the rollout of the product, and we were able to say, okay, certain customer types will have a lower probability of being aware of the product in each of these subsequent years based on the marketing plan.
So again, coming back to the knowledge and perception of existing products.
So, and this gets into the idea where we adjusted the choice sets. We realized that some alternatives wouldn't be in the choice set or would be less likely to be in the choice set, in the early years, but over time, they would be in, and then we could predict what the financial results would be over time.
Right.
So, we had those sorts of issues. We also had issues with regard to framing because we had monthly lease options, and you needed to compare those to system purchase prices. And oftentimes, even if they were purchasing a product, they were financing it internally, so the expense looked a little bit more like a lease. And we needed to make sure that the prices were framed in a way that they saw the price and would respond accordingly.
Excellent, excellent. So I think in the end, coming back to this market model. I think you also use the term demand model. I mean, we've heard in literature people use market and demand model. Are those exactly the same?
Well, the differences are so subtle that it's probably not important to point out. But essentially, what we're trying to do is we're trying to predict actual choices. So, the key thing is that preference modeling is a really good first step. It's particularly valuable when you are trying to set your research and development priorities and see what features are likely to appeal to customers. But when you get down to the pricing decision, you want to try to account for other factors that will influence choice in the actual purchase decision. So effective market modeling can significantly improve on the predictive accuracy, and actually goes through a calibration step to get the model to fit as well as possible. And just by a little bit of an improvement in the predictions, you can get a substantial improvement in your pricing decision, which will have a big impact on price.
Excellent. Scott, I hear from Melissa we don't have any particular question. We are at the very end of our Pricing 301 segment today. And since there's no questions, I'd like to thank you very much, Scott, for presenting such an eloquent way to improve model choice prediction. And I think, again, there's always a role for each modeling. Preference model, nothing wrong, but you've got to be aware that it could be very inaccurate at times, depending on situations. Sometimes we can be lucky and have a very good prediction just by doing preference modeling. But I think people understand today that to go to the next step and really optimize pricing decision, I think it's recommended to go through a complete market model. And I think we had a good illustration today. Thank you, Scott, very much.
It was nice to be with you.
Absolutely. Thank you to the audience. Now the webinar is officially finished. Thank you.